So when we wanted to rise up and build last week, we got into chapters 4, 5, and 6. And chapters 4, 5, and 6, as you can see, are mainly focused on determination. We spoke about in chapter 3 their cooperation, and what did they do in chapter 3? What was a good description of their cooperation? What was a good description of their cooperation? Chapter 3. They worked together, side by side. And how were they able to work together side by side? You had to split up, you had to divide up your work. And as they divided up their work, they were able to do it. Now again, the time frame was short. How long was the time frame of this entire work? 52 days. And you would imagine, we're going to talk about in just a little bit, we've got to rise up and build too. You would imagine that in 52 days, because if you think about it, you could probably say, it doesn't matter what I have to do for 52 days, because no matter what, I can do it, because it's only 52 days. What did they face? As we get into chapters 4, 5, and 6, what did they face? Right off the bat in chapter 4, what was it? They had to deal with Sanballat, and it was ridicule and it was slander. So ridicule and slander. How does that affect people? Because you would think, well, it's just ridicule and slander, but it's still what? It's still very demoralizing. Sure, it can break your spirit. It can break your spirit. Nehemiah was, again, able to handle this, able to deal with the open ridicule. Beginning in verse 7 of chapter 4, down through verse 11, what happened to them? They were what? They were kind of discouraged. You look down in verse 10. It's only 52 days, but the newness kind of what? The newness kind of wears off. Verse 10, there was so much what? Rubbish. Verse 10, you lose that confidence. There's so much rubbish around. All of a sudden, in verse 10, you feel like you can't what? Can't work. Then in verse 11, of course, what took place? Their adversaries. So you had a loss of security. So think about this. You got a loss of strength, a loss of vision, a loss of confidence, and a loss of security. And you're ready to what? You're ready to give up. Yeah, ready to give up. But again, Nehemiah could help, because in verse 11, he was able to turn their attention to what? They were kind of in the midst of self-pity. He pulled them more to if you think about it literally, self-preservation. Look down in verse 14. What did he do? He directed them to who? To God. What were they looking at? What were they looking at? They were looking at the ruins. They were looking at the enemies. He got them looking toward God. He got them looking toward God. That's really, really good to remember when we get discouraged. He was able to, as you kind of start in verse 14 and you go down into verse 17, he balanced them with thoughts and with actions, with faith and with works, instilling them in looking to the Lord, putting their faith in the Lord. But putting your faith in the Lord doesn't mean what? That you just sit back. It doesn't mean that you stop. So let's put our faith in the Lord. But the Lord's not going to what? Yeah, he's not going to put one brick on top of the other. You're the one that's going to have to do that. But who will be there? Lord will. Yeah, God will. He was able to get them around a rallying point. Look in verses 19 and 20. What does he do with them? What's he do in 19 and 20? Yeah, he does kind of give them a pep talk. In looking at, the shared desire that they all had, which would be to have a wall in the city, to have everything that the city needed for them to carry on, to feel safe, he was able to find a rallying point and bring them all around the rallying point. And then verses 21 and 22, which is it's a very neat thought. It may not be directly related to the building of a wall, but what was he able to do in 21 and 22? Getting the plan, and what did the plan entail? Yeah, making sure that everyone and everyone's needs were taken care of. And you can see this. There have literally been books written about the leadership style of Nehemiah. And even though you look at it and you're looking at just a very straightforward account, Nehemiah is not giving you his insights on why he determines a rallying point and the psychology behind the rallying point. He didn't do any of that. He just does it. And as you kind of begin to pull those steps apart, you get a really nice insight into godly leadership. And it wasn't mind games. It wasn't hocus pocus. It was just taking people and dealing with people's problems and dealing with people's issues and getting them to see and serve a greater need. A lot of time, and I have to be careful about this, but a lot of hesitate wanting to jump off the deep end on this. A lot of times when people are having difficulties, they need to be reminded that they're not alone and that there's a lot of other work that can be done other than focusing on what? On themselves. On themselves. Don't take that to mean that I would just wave off everyone's problems by just saying you need to think about something different. Because there are people who do legitimately suffer with some very, very significant things. But there's a lot of times when people are down, when they're depressed and when they're discouraged, and all they need is a reminder of something that's higher and more noble in their life. And usually that's the Lord, doing the Lord's will, and trying to look outside of yourself. And amazingly, that brings a lot of people around in some very trying circumstances. Okay, chapter 5, what happens? Chapter 5 actually looks at this in a kind of you would think in chapter 4 that all the problems get taken care of. But then you get to chapter 5. And what were they doing in chapter 5? They were kind of taking advantage of it. How much is a generator at Lowe's or Home Depot? How much? About 600 during a hurricane. How much is it? Double it, probably. 1,200. Why is that? Why is that? Supply and demand, supply and demand. However, what was happening among the Jews? In this time of crisis, and remember, how long was the crisis? It was, it was only what? Only how long? Only 52 days. What were they doing to one another? They were taking advantage of the fact that they were hungry. They were taking advantage of the fact that they were kind of off of what they would normally do because they're trying to build this wall. And it was creating a lot of internal strife. So how does Nehemiah deal with it? What's kind of interesting is that Nehemiah, in verse 6, I became very angry when I heard their outcry in these words, and I rebuked them. And he said, each of you is exacting usury from his brother. So I called a great assembly against them. So what's usury? It's what? It's interest. It's interest. But it's also what? It's not just interest. It's excess. Right. It's excess interest. So what does he do? He becomes, angry about it, and he just goes in and declares that it's got to stop. So everything basically goes back to the way that it was before the wall started getting built. So none of this, you're going to give away your land for nothing. None of this, you're going to pay exorbitant prices for all of these things. All of the ways in which you Jews are trying to make money is going to stop. And that's the way that he dealt with the internal strife. He just basically went in and stopped everything from happening other than the normal supply and the normal demand of things. Then we get to chapter 6. And chapter 6 we can sum up pretty easily. What happens in chapter 6? And there's a lot of ins and outs to it, but we don't need to go through that. But basically just what happens in chapter 6. They try to actually conspire against Nehemiah. So much so that they're trying to what? Trying to lay a trap for him and kill him. Yes, lay a trap for him and kill him. But he sees that, and he avoids that, and was able to keep himself out of harm. And again, through chapter 4, 5, and 6, it's got that repeating theme, a great theme in Nehemiah, that the hand of what? Hand of God. He was with me. So 4, 5, and 6 are chapters of opposition. You've got the opposition of just the people building the wall beginning to be discouraged. You had the opposition of people then starting to take advantage of the situation. And then you had where they're just trying to go to the very source, Nehemiah, and get rid of it completely. So let's talk about some of the lessons. Is it time for us to rise up? Is it time for us to rise up? It's always time for us to what? To rise up. Always time for us to rise up. And when you see in front of you Nehemiah 2 verse 12 and verse 18 and chapter 3 verse 1 and chapter 4 verse 14 are all the commands or all of the mentions in the book of Nehemiah that they rose up. So we know that it's always a time for us to rise up and then a time for us to build. And what do we build? What do we build? Matthew chapter 16 verse 18, what did Jesus say? Upon this rock I will build my church. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verses 9 and 10. Paul talked about us really as all being what? Builders. Some of our building will be like gold and silver. Some of it will be like what? Wood and hay and stubble. It'll be burned up. But the fact that we did the work, the fact that we built the way that we should have built, that won't ever go away. That'll always be to our eternal credit. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verses 20 and 21, what are we a part of? Ephesians chapter 2 verses 20 and 21, what are we a part of? part of a temple. And what do you do with the temple? You know, these are always really, really great metaphors. You do have to, of course, understand that sometimes a metaphor can only be pushed so far. But in chapter 2, verse 20, we're built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ Himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. Well, when does that growing stop? When does that growing stop? It never stops. And there'll be some in the audience who's, you know, they won't be with us after a few years. But what will happen once they've gone? There'll be other, you know, the kids. They'll grow up, they'll reach that point where they want to be Christians, and then what will happen with them? They'll start what? They'll start building. Yeah, they'll start building. And that just keeps on for generations, as long as a congregation lasts. We rise up and we build. The same message in Colossians chapter 2, verse 20, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11. Jude verse 20 is an interesting kind of different one. What does Jude verse 20 tell us? That we do what? We build ourselves up in the most, or on the most holy faith, praying in the Holy Spirit, keeping yourselves in the love of God, looking for the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ unto eternal life. So I have to help build as far as the work is concerned, as far as the cause of Christ is concerned. But part of a subset of that is me building on and working on who? Myself. Building on and working on myself. So how do I need to build? Well, just thinking about this. I can build with some very important points. I build with consideration. So Philippians chapter 2 and verse 20. Let's look in Philippians chapter 2 verse 20. And just note the consideration. Philippians chapter 2 and the 20th verse. It reads, "For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state." What does it mean to build with consideration? We have to what? And we have to care for someone else's state. Care for someone else's state. Who was this talking about, by the way, if you back up into verse 19? He was talking about Timothy. I wanted to send Timothy so that I also may be encouraged when I know your state, because I have no one what? Like-minded, who will what? Who will sincerely care for you. When I build with consideration. But who do I need to consider? Sure, I need to consider myself, but I also need to consider who? Everyone else. Yeah, exactly right. Supplication, Colossians chapter 4. What does Colossians chapter 4 tell us? Colossians chapter 4 and verses 2 and 3 tell us. Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant with it in thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us, that God would open us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I'm also in chains. I build with supplication, which means what? Practically. Practically speaking, what does that mean? That I what? Okay, that we pray and ask for thanksgiving. But what do we... So I've got to do so, and it kind of occurs to me that there is another little point that could be put in, but I'll come to that in just a second. I need to be praying, but what do I need to pray for? I need to pray for opportunities. I need to pray for myself, because remember, everything begins with you having the courage to actually jump out there and talk to someone, invite someone, actually study with someone. All of that begins with the courage to do it. And Nehemiah had to face the same issue. In chapter 2, before he actually addressed the king, remember, it wasn't given to us in a textual form, but what did Nehemiah do? He prayed. He prayed. I need to pray for people. And I don't just mean I pray for people everywhere to hear the gospel. I need to pray for who? I need to pray for specific people. People who are on my mind. People that I want to actually try to do something with. Because that's part of the consideration. That's part of being of the same mind and caring about their state. I care enough to what? Pray for them. And I care enough to actually actively work for them. Now, I said that there's another little point that could bring up, and maybe I need to put this in the notes. Notice in verse 6, what do I need to also do? Let your speech be with what? With grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Along with supplication, I need then to remember, what about myself? I need to learn how to what? Relate. I need to know how to handle situations. I need to know how to handle circumstances. And I need to what? I need to pray for that. I need to pray for wisdom, not just to know how to answer someone when I get a question that normally would stump me, but what else do I need to pray for? What I say and how I say it. I mean, you guys know. You guys have all been in religious conversations. They can what? Really fast. They can get heated. They can elevate. We're coming up on Thanksgiving and Christmas, the holidays. You're going to be around family. And there are times when those conversations get into either religion or politics. And so you kind of pray that you're able to handle everything in an appropriate way. And that's part of what Colossians chapter 4 verse 6 says. So I need to pray not just for them, but I also need to, of course, pray for myself. 2 Timothy 2 verse 21, let's repeat what we read earlier. 2 Timothy 2 verse 21, what's mentioned there? 2 Timothy 2 verse 21. In preparation, I need to cleanse myself so that I will be a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful, and prepared. Sanctified, useful, and prepared. Remember that. 3 great words that the verse ends with. Sanctified, useful, and prepared. There's your sermon outline, Randy, for your next sermon. Sanctified, useful, and prepared. Okay, motivation. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. What does Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 say? Okay, he says that we need to provoke. Now, what does provoking mean? Stir up. Stir up. Because normally provoking, going back to thinking about Thanksgiving and Christmas with politics and religion, provoking doesn't mean what? Making them mad. It doesn't mean making them mad. And, you know, we're all intelligent enough to know what's going to make people mad and what isn't. I may not know everything that's going to make you mad, but I only have to know how many things will make you mad. I only have to know one and then use it and you're mad. I don't need a whole deep dive into your psyche. All I need to know is one or two things and say it, and you're mad. Stirring up means what? It means that what? It means that I'm going to encourage. And how can we encourage? How can we encourage? And let's make sure that everything is on the table and we understand everything that's on the table when it comes to stirring up. So how do you stir someone up? How do you provoke someone? Okay, so first of all, you can be a good example. That is a very worthy thing. Because no matter how you talk to them, which is where the rest of this conversation is going to go, no matter how much you talk to them, it's useless if what? If they're not seeing it in you. Okay, so actually having conversations with people. Now, how can you stir them up? How can you stir them up? You can take a very slow, soft, gentle approach at encouraging. A lot of times that works wonders. What else can you do? Well, yes, you can pray for them, but in the context of conversations, what can you do? Okay. You can kind of find out what might be holding them back. Find out what might be holding them back, because a lot of times it may be completely unknown to you. What else can you do? Sometimes to stir people up, to encourage people, you can give them something to do. You can give them something to do. And what that is going to be depending on that person. Sometimes you give someone something to do, it's just a little bitty minor thing, but boy, it's right in their wheelhouse. It's exactly what they can do. Sometimes you give someone something to do, like teaching a Bible class. That is of a much higher scale. I know that. But generally you don't ask unless you have confidence that they can what? That they can do it. So you can put people to work, and that can be something that can encourage them. But one more thing, there are times when we stir people up by being very what with them? Very blunt, very direct with people. Not necessarily angry, not trying to pull out an angry response to them, but just being very, very direct with people. That's what some people respond to. And they don't respond to anything else. So you don't take everything off of the table. What you do take off of the table is reacting out of anger, reacting in an inappropriate way to people that you're presumably trying to help them to get to heaven. And that kind of all works into this whole idea of motivating them. Okay, cooperation, just the last couple of two. Cooperation in Ephesians 4, verses 12 and 16. Paul writes about making the body and all of the parts of the body work together. That's the cooperation. And then, of course, in determination in 1 Peter 15, verse 58, before the bell rings, what does 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58 talk about? Be steadfast, immovable, always what? Abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Coming at the end of the discussion on the resurrection. So now, believing in a resurrection, you need to keep on going. And you need to abound in that work. And that's part of our continuing effort. I just want to mention to you real quick, they could build the wall in 52 days. When we talk about building ourselves or building on this holy temple, the church, it's a work that lasts a lot longer than 52 days. That's why I ended with this point. It takes a lot of determination. Next time we'll go into chapter 7 and 8 and look at the book of the law.